Have you ever spent an entire day trying to make everything just right, only to fall into bed at night wondering why you still felt empty? There's an old story from China about a farmer. One day, his horse ran away. His neighbors said, "What? Bad luck." The farmer simply replied, "Maybe." The next day, the horse returned, bringing with it 3 wild horses. The neighbors cheered, "What good luck?" Again, the farmer said, "Maybe." The following day, the farmer's son broke his leg while trying to ride one of the wild horses. The neighbors gasped, "Oh no, how terrible." "Maybe," the farmer said again. Days later, soldiers came to draft young men for war, but skipped. The farmer's injured son. "Such good fortune," said the neighbors. And the farmer smiled softly. Maybe. This story has lived for centuries because it holds a quiet wisdom. Not everything needs to be judged, forced, or fixed. Sometimes, life just needs to unfold. Eleanor Davis didn't know this story when she turned 74. She had lived a full life, a devoted mother, a meticulous planner, a woman who made things happen. But when her husband passed and her children moved far away, the house that once buzzed with rhythm now echoed in silence. She tried to keep it all together. Meals at 7, garden at 9, bills paid by 10. But no matter how organized she kept her days, something inside her felt unsteady, not broken, just tired of holding it all up. One chilly morning, at the local library, she stumbled upon a slender book with faded gold letters, Tao, the Way of Water. Inside it was a chapter on Wu Wei, the art of effortless action, of letting go without giving up, of trusting the flow instead of forcing the outcome. She read that trees don't struggle to grow. Water doesn't push through rocks, it glides around them. Nature doesn't resist, and yet it accomplishes everything. And that was the beginning of her new season, not of doing more, but of releasing more. In this story, we follow Eleanor's journey from control to calm, from effort to ease. Along the way, you might find echoes of your own life, places where you're still holding on too tight, trying too hard, or forgetting that sometimes peace comes when we stop chasing it. If you've ever felt like you're constantly swimming upstream, this video is for you. We invite you to take a deep breath, settle in, and listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart. And if this story resonates with you, we'd love for you to support our channel by subscribing, sharing, or simply leaving a comment, because maybe, just maybe, you're not the only one learning how to let go. The river doesn't ask for directions. Eleanor Davis had always believed in the power of planning. All her life, she'd made it her quiet mission to keep things in order: family schedules, birthdays, Sunday meals, even how the kitchen towels should be folded. There was a comfort in structure, in knowing what came next. After her husband passed, and the children were grown with lives of their own, that structure became even more important. It was no longer about efficiency. It was about stability, about feeling that something, anything, was still within her grasp. But lately, even with every drawer organized and every morning timed to the minute, she'd felt a growing ache. It was subtle, but persistent, a kind of inner heaviness, like she was constantly bracing herself for something she couldn't name. Her days were full of small, controlled movements. Tea brewed just right, the bed made perfectly smooth, the to-do list checked off by noon. But her spirit felt like it was pacing in circles. She told herself it was just part of aging. She'd earned her routines. And yet, something inside her had started to whisper, softly but insistently, "There has to be another way to live." That whisper became louder one afternoon in early spring. The sky was high and quiet, and a cool breeze slipped through the open window, carrying with it the scent of thawing earth. Eleanor, without fully knowing why, put on her light jacket and walked toward the small wooded path near her neighborhood, the one that wound its way past a little brook. She hadn't walked that trail in years, not since before everything changed. As she reached the curve where the brook came into view, she slowed her steps. The water moved easily, winding its way between stones and branches, glimmering in the sun. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't still either. It moved with a kind of quiet determination, never rushed, never forced, just flowing. She stood there for a long while, watching it. The water didn't resist the rocks in its path. It didn't crash or complain. It simply shifted, glided, adapted, always moving forward, always responding. Not once did it stop to ask, "Is this the right way?" It trusted the bend, the dip, the current. It had no agenda. It didn't fight its surroundings. It became them. And in that moment, something broke loose in Eleanor. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gently, like a tight thread beginning to loosen after years of being pulled too hard. It wasn't that she understood it all immediately, but something inside her softened. She sat down on a bench nearby, hands resting in her lap, and allowed herself the rare gift of stillness. She didn't think about what she needed to do later. She didn't mentally sort through errands or guilt-trip herself over unfinished tasks. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't steering anything. She wasn't holding on. She wasn't proving herself useful, and the world didn't fall apart. That night, she left the dishes in the sink. She didn't plan tomorrow's meals. She read a few pages from a book, then let it fall closed in her lap as she stared out the window. The streetlight flickered on, casting a soft yellow glow across her porch, and Eleanor whispered aloud, to no one in particular, "Maybe I've been trying too hard." She thought again of the brook, how it simply met the world where it was. No resistance, no questions. It didn't ask where to go or how fast to get there. It let gravity and nature carry it. And maybe, just maybe, there was wisdom in doing the same. Eleanor didn't yet have a name for what she'd begun to feel. She didn't know it was called Wu Wei, but something in her had shifted. She didn't need to understand it all. She just knew this. The river didn't ask for directions. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to stop asking, too. Surrender isn't giving up. Eleanor never thought of herself as someone who tried to control others. She had always framed it differently. She was being helpful, looking out, offering guidance. Especially when it came to her daughter, Susan. After all, wasn't that what mothers did, even after their children grew up? They advised. They checked in. They reminded. But over time, those small nudges had become walls between them, built slowly, unintentionally, brick by brick. Susan was busy. She had her own family now, 2 children, a demanding job, and a life that spun with the same hurried energy Eleanor remembered from her own younger days. Their conversations had become shorter, more guarded. Eleanor would call with reminders or suggestions. Don't forget the school enrollment deadline. Have you taken the kids to the dentist? Did you consider refinancing the house? Each time, Susan's voice would tighten, sometimes offering a short thank you, other times nothing at all. The last conversation between them had ended not with an argument, but with a silence that felt far more final. Susan had paused after another well-meaning suggestion from Eleanor and said, quietly but firmly, "Mom, I love you, but I need space. I need to do things my way." Eleanor had stood in the middle of her kitchen, phone in hand, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where her daughter's voice had been. That hum stayed with her the rest of the day. It sounded like loneliness. That night, she walked back to the brook. The trail was quieter than usual. Even the water seemed slower, as if it too was in a contemplative mood. Eleanor sat on the same bench as before, staring out at the soft ripple of current against stone. She remembered something the book had said about Wu Wei, how sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is not do, not act, not speak, not interfere. Letting go, she realized, wasn't the same as giving up. It was trusting the space in between she did something she hadn't done in years. She wrote a letter by hand. Not a letter to instruct, explain, or convince, but simply to reach out. "Dear Susan," she wrote, "I've realized I've been holding on too tightly, trying to help in ways that maybe you didn't ask for. I'm learning how to be quiet. I'm learning how to trust you. I just wanted you to know, I'm here when you're ready." She mailed it the next morning. Without expectation, weeks passed. She didn't check her phone obsessively. She didn't rehearse what she'd say if Susan called. She simply waited, not with anxious tension, but with something closer to peace. And then, one sunny afternoon, a familiar car pulled into her driveway. Eleanor looked up from her garden tools to see Susan stepping out, 2 coffees in hand and no big words were spoken, no explanations required. They sat on the porch, sipping slowly, watching the breeze move through the trees. There was no plan for the future, no dissecting the past, just a shared stillness, a presence. Eleanor understood then what the river had been trying to show her all along. Love doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it breathes. Sometimes it lets go. She hadn't lost her daughter. She had simply stopped trying to hold her so tightly. And in that space, something real had returned. Surrender, she now knew, was not a sign of weakness. It was the deepest kind of strength, a quiet trust that life and love will find their way when we stop trying to carry it all alone. Stillness is a kind of movement. In the weeks after Susan's visit, Eleanor found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, sitting still without needing to fill the silence. It didn't happen intentionally. At first, it came in small moments, pausing between tasks to watch a squirrel dart across the fence, letting her tea grow lukewarm as she stared out the kitchen window, forgetting, just for a moment, to finish her list for the day. These tiny lapses used to unsettle her. They felt like cracks in her routine, evidence that she was slipping somehow. But now, they felt like openings. Spaces she didn't need to rush to fill. There had always been a part of her that associated stillness with failure. If she wasn't moving, wasn't producing, wasn't checking something off a list, then what was she doing? Rest had always felt like an afterthought, something you earned after the work was done, and only if everything had been done just right. But now, sitting in the late morning sun on her back porch, hands folded in her lap, Eleanor realized she was beginning to understand something she'd never had words for. Stillness wasn't the absence of movement. It was a different kind of movement altogether. It was the movement of breath, the soft shifting of awareness, the way the body settles when it finally realizes it doesn't have to brace itself against the day. She thought of all the years she'd been busy raising children, keeping the house, managing schedules. She had been a good mother, a dependable wife, a reliable neighbor. She had moved through the world like a current, purposeful, necessary. But what no one had told her, and what she was only now beginning to learn, was that purpose doesn't always look like doing. Sometimes, it looks like being, like listening instead of talking, like watching the wind move through trees instead of rushing to rake the leaves. One afternoon, Eleanor brought out a small notebook and began writing. Not a journal, not a plan, just fragments. Things she noticed. The way the light changed on the floor throughout the day, the quiet confidence in the way her neighbor's old dog walked, the strange comfort of hearing her own breath in a quiet room. These notes weren't for anyone else. They were small conversations with herself, each line a reminder that presence had value. Even when it produced nothing measurable, she had never meditated. She wasn't even sure she knew how. But sometimes, when she sat very still and her thoughts softened, she felt something inside her rearrange. Not dramatically, just gently, like furniture being moved in the back room of a quiet house. And in those moments, she felt the same sense of peace she had felt by the brook. That same knowing, there is nowhere to get to, nowhere to arrive. The being is enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the edge of her garden, Eleanor sat on her porch with a blanket over her knees and thought, not with longing, but with gratitude, about all the years she had spent in motion. And then she smiled, because now, in stillness, she was moving in a new way. Inward, deeper, quieter. The world outside was still spinning, but she no longer felt the need to keep pace. She didn't need to chase, to fix, to plan. She could simply be. And somehow, that felt like the most profound motion of all. Decision is simpler without the noise. There came a morning when Eleanor knew something had shifted. Not dramatically, not with some grand realization, but in a quiet way, like the way dawn slowly overtakes darkness without asking for permission. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a warm mug, when the thought arrived, clear and calm. It's time to leave this house. It wasn't a thought she had invited. For years, she had told herself she'd stay in the home she had built with her husband until the very end. The creak in the hallway floor, the chipped tile in the bathroom, even the stubborn garden gate. These were not just details, they were memories stitched into the walls like old photographs. But now, something in her heart no longer clung to them with the same urgency. The house had held her for so long. Now it felt like it was ready to let her go. For weeks, the idea hovered. She didn't rush into action. She didn't call realtors or search for listings or make pros and cons lists the way she once would have. Instead, she sat with the thought. She walked with it. Let it breathe beside her in the stillness she was only just beginning to trust. Once, the mere idea of such a change would have sent her spiraling into analysis. What if she regretted it? What if she was acting too soon? What would her children think? But now, the questions didn't feel urgent. They didn't demand immediate answers. She had learned that clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from listening more gently. Point one day, while visiting a friend at a senior living community just a few towns over, she sat by a window with a cup of chamomile tea. Outside, the courtyard was quiet, dotted with soft laughter and the low murmur of two men playing chess. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and lilacs. Eleanor watched a young woman, perhaps a staff member, help an elderly man plant something in a raised garden bed. There was no rush, no tension, just small, deliberate movements. Presence. She felt something in her chest eased out on the drive home. The answer settled in her like a pebble finding its place at the bottom of a stream. Not heavy, not dramatic, just true. That night, she didn't announce it to anyone. She didn't even write it down. She simply whispered it to herself, as if sharing a secret with her own soul. I'm ready to move forward. What had once felt like a mountain to climb now felt like a gentle turn in the path. She didn't know every detail of what would come next, but she didn't need to. The decision had already been made, not by pressure or fear, but by the quiet wisdom that had been waiting patiently beneath all the noise. She had discovered something she wished she'd known earlier in life, that the best decisions don't come from pushing or rushing or overthinking. They come when we allow space, when we trust that we already know more than we realize, when we let the noise settle long enough for the truth to rise that in the silence. There had always been an answer. She just hadn't known how to hear it until now. The garden that grows when left alone. Eleanor didn't leave the house right away. The decision had been made, yes, but not everything needed to happen at once. That, too, was something she was learning. Life didn't need to be rushed to be real. Some transitions were more like seasons, quiet, slow, inevitable. In the weeks that followed, she found herself returning to a part of the house she had long neglected, the back garden. It was small, bordered by a weathered fence, with a bird bath that hadn't held water in years and flower beds that had once been carefully maintained but were now a tangle of weeds and dry soil. She had loved that garden once. When her husband was alive, they had spent entire weekends planting vegetables and watching bees move from bloom to bloom. It had been their shared project, their quiet ritual. After he passed, she'd stopped tending to it, not out of neglect, but out of pain. It felt like something that belonged to a world that no longer existed. But now, as the sunlight grew warmer and the days stretched longer, Eleanor stepped into the overgrown garden with a pair of gloves and no plan. She didn't sketch a layout. She didn't buy fertilizer or research what would bloom best in partial shade. She simply began by sitting, letting the wind move her hair, listening to the distant sound of a lawnmower on another street, watching a single dandelion sway in the breeze. That at first, she only pulled weeds when she felt like it. She let certain wild things stay, small purple flowers she didn't recognize but that had insisted on growing. She watered when she remembered. Some days she forgot. But the strange thing was, things still grew. The garden didn't need her to direct it. It just needed space, sunlight, time. It began to teach her something new, something different than what she had learned by the brook or in silence or in letting go of control with her daughter. It showed her that care doesn't always mean interference, that beauty can emerge in places left untouched. One morning, she noticed a new patch of green climbing along the fence, something she hadn't planted. Its leaves were delicate, with small white buds beginning to form. She watched it for days as the buds turned to blossoms. They were nothing spectacular, simple, star-shaped, with a sweet scent she couldn't name, but there was something about their quiet arrival that moved her. It felt like the garden had decided, on its own, to offer her something back. She sat on the porch that evening, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. She thought about all the years she had spent trying to make things bloom, relationships, plans, expectations. And now, without effort, something had bloomed anyway. Maybe not the way she would have chosen. Maybe not in perfect rows, but in its own way. In its own time. That's when she understood. There are gardens inside us too. Places we've abandoned because we thought we had to control them to keep them alive. But maybe those parts of us are just waiting for less effort, for less fixing, for more stillness, for space. Eleanor would leave the house soon, but she'd carry this garden with her, not in potted plants or cuttings, but in what it had taught her. That letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means trusting that life knows how to grow, even when we stop trying to shape every leaf. A life that flows. The day Eleanor handed over the keys to the house, the sky stretched wide above her, clear and still, like it was holding its breath with her. She stood on the porch for a long time, letting her eyes move over the familiar corners, the place where the mailbox leaned slightly, the chimes that sang every time the wind rolled through. She didn't rush to leave. She didn't linger out of sadness either. Instead, she stood quietly, simply allowing the moment to settle. Then, without fanfare, she turned and walked away. There were no grand goodbyes, no dramatic turning points. Only space, only breath, and the simple sense that she was ready. Her new home wasn't large or sentimental. It was a modest apartment tucked within a quiet senior community on the edge of town. The windows were wide and let in generous light. The courtyard below was planted with maple trees and lilac bushes, and in the early morning, the shadows danced along the walls just the way they used to on her garden fence. She brought with her only what mattered: some favorite books, a few black and white photos in worn wooden frames, and a small clay pot carrying the white star-shaped flowers that had grown wild in her backyard. A gift from the earth, now rooted. In her new beginning, she settled into a rhythm that didn't need to be named. Mornings began without alarms. Sometimes she read a chapter from an old novel. Sometimes she simply watched the sunlight shift across the floor. On Tuesdays, she joined a small group of residents who gathered for tea and conversation. They talked about everything and nothing: how memory worked, how time moved strangely after 70, how joy was sometimes found in the smallest things. There was no need to perform, no need to impress, just presence. It was a life she wouldn't have recognized 10 years ago. Back then, she would have called it slow, maybe even empty. But now, she understood. The quiet was not emptiness. It was fullness of another kind, a soft returning to herself. Not the version always busy proving something, but the version who could sit with uncertainty and still feel whole. What Eleanor had discovered was something she wished she'd been told earlier. Not all peace is earned through effort. Not every answer requires action. Sometimes, what we need most is to step back, let the noise fade, and trust that life knows how to move without our constant steering. It always has. Like water in a stream, like wind through leaves, like breath through the body, she had not abandoned her life. She had not disappeared. She had flowed into a new season with grace, letting go not as surrender, but as trust. Trust in herself, in the rhythm of things, in the deep intelligence of stillness. And if any part of her story speaks to you now, perhaps it's because something in you is also ready. Ready to ease the grip, to listen to the quiet, to stop controlling everything, and begin, at last, to flow. Older. Other days, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and simply watched the wind play with the curtains. Her life now didn't look productive in the traditional sense, but for the first time, it felt truly alive. Not because of what she did, but because of how she moved through each moment, with ease, with openness, with the understanding that flow is not something you find. It's something you allow. She had spent much of her life steering, striving, holding it all together. But now she knew there is a quiet power in stepping back, in listening instead of fixing, in being instead of proving. There's wisdom in the pause, grace in the letting go, and in the gentle unfolding of things. Life continues, softly, steadily, just as it always has. Sometimes, the most profound change doesn't arrive with noise or celebration. It comes like water, slow, persistent, shaping you without resistance. It's not dramatic, but it's real. Eleanor didn't set out to transform her life. She simply stopped fighting it. And in doing so, she found her way back to herself. Not the version who had everything figured out, but the one who could sit with uncertainty and still feel whole. If any part of Eleanor's journey has found its way into your own heart, perhaps it's because part of you is ready to loosen your grip, ready to trust the timing, ready to stop controlling everything and start flowing. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it stayed with you, even for a moment, we invite you to stay connected, subscribe, share your thoughts, or simply take a breath. You don't have to do anything more. Sometimes, the beginning of change is simply choosing to sit still and listen.